Hello, everyone. I'm James Harkins, host of This Week in Texas History, a weekly show that is part of the Save Texas History program. Save Texas History is brought to you by Commissioner George P. Bush and the Texas General Land Office. If you love our state's history and want to make sure that it lasts forever, please visit savetexashistory.org and consider making a tax-deductible donation. Hello, everyone. Today we've got Dr. Gene Preuss, who is our guest. Dr. Preuss teaches at the University of Houston downtown. Prior to that, he taught at Texas Tech University, Texas Southern University, and the Lone Star Community College. He is also active in state, regional, and national history organizations, including the East Texas Historical Association, the Texas State Historical Association, the West Texas Historical Association, and he was president of the HNet Council, and he was president of the East Texas Historical Association. Gene, thank you for being here.
James, thanks a lot for having me. It's an honor to be on your show. Thank you.
One thing that I've learned about you is that you've had many roles in higher education, specifically with an emphasis on Texas history. And now you're involved with working with a lot of students at the University of Houston downtown. Can you talk a little bit about your experience teaching Texas history and how it has helped shape your research in what you're doing today?
So I started teaching, I had my own classes when I started at Texas Tech. I got my master's degree in San Marcos at what was then Texas State, what's today Texas State University. It was Southwest Texas State University when I went to school there. And I had my own classes. I probably taught the same way that I was taught, which was a lot of lecturing, 3 tests, multiple choice essay, and that was about it. And it was pretty straightforward. I think today, though, I probably teach a lot different than I did, and certainly the way that I was taught. And one of the things I want to do in teaching is try to teach students to look for people like themselves. I mean, this is one of the things about history. And if you look at a lot of the people who write history, you write what you know. Or you write what interests you. So it's not unusual for historians to have some sort of something personal vested in what they research. And so now today, I think that I try to teach people, my students, how to learn about history close to them, the history of themselves and how they're reflected in history today, rather than just kind of telling stories about the past.
It is interesting that you point out that whenever you were taught, it was lectures about maybe great people, great commanders, and how whenever you teach today, you try to make a connection with students. Can you briefly just discuss challenges that you've noticed with teaching in this new format that we've got for last semester, this upcoming semester?
Well, it's funny. I was when I came to the University of Houston downtown. That was in 2004 when I was hired there, and people were just starting to talk more and more about teaching online. But it wasn't. When I was at Lone Star, what was North Harris Montgomery at the time, but Lone Star, they wanted us to start doing some online. Putting your syllabus up with the various classes. And when I came to UHC in 2004, there was more and more, and it just kind of gradually grew. And so I kind of embraced that. I was one of the first history professors at UH downtown to teach online. And I've got to say, I did not do a very good job. I don't know that I'm doing a good job now, but it was even worse back then because I didn't really know what I was doing. I was just trying to take kind of what I would do face to face and put it online. The secret of the academic profession, right, is that outside of curriculum instruction and teaching faculty, most faculty when I was coming up, had not had any experience in the art and science of teaching, right? I was a historian, and so all of the courses I took in my graduate level, my master's and my PhD were only on history, not in the teaching of history. And so, like I said, I taught kind of how I was taught, which was the sage on the stage model, where you've got a professor, a learned person who is spewing out lectures that they may have given over and over again for years, and just telling stories. That was fine. I mean, I learned that way, and I thought that's just how students learned. And it was only after I started doing, I was involved in some student success initiatives when I came to UHD, and I really kind of learned the difference between teaching the way I was taught, which is just being told these stories, and actually learning how to teach. I'm a historian of education. I was saying, my first interest was in LBJ. When I wrote my thesis for my master's, I wrote about him as a public school teacher. So I've been studying the history of education for a good while now, and looking, and so I'm kind of coming, when I look at teaching and how we change teaching, I look at it kind of through a historical perspective and see the way we have progressed. Now with the Zoom, this is so much different from the way we used to teach. In many ways, I'm going to say this, and I know people are going to disagree with me. I think it may be more intimate, a more one-on-one teaching experience. If I'm sitting in a class with 40 or 50 students, there are people sitting off in the corners that, I see their faces from 30, 40 feet away. And, I may glance at them. I may remember what they look like when they're in the hall. I may remember them a year from now. But with Zoom, anytime a student asks a question, I see them up close, and I can hear them. Right? I don't have to, keep saying, what, I didn't hear you, I'm old. Keep repeating yourself. So it's a different type of teaching, and I think in some ways more intimate. How to change from what you can do in face-to-face to what you can do in online. It still means setting up the structure of the class and your learning management system a lot different.
Can you talk a little bit about how historians, history students worked in the past versus how they work today, using old technologies versus new technologies? And what are some of the challenges that you've seen that are in the past that maybe translate to what we're doing today?
So when I was going to school, my first year of graduate, when I was working my master's degree at Texas State, the professor, who was a older and distinguished professor, he taught us, you took note cards, and one note card had your bibliographic information, another note card had your little notes, and keep them on the note cards. Well, I've got a lot more to write. Well, keep them brief, you can always expound later. And they were cross-referenced with each other, and you had to go to archives or libraries to actually find the information and hold it in your hand, because that's how information was passed on. Today, it's much different. So when I got to UH downtown, my dean was suggesting that we look for better ways of, rather than just the multiple choice test. And she goes, well, can't you have students, go online and find primary sources? And in those, 2004, 2005, there was digitization, there was digital history, and people and archives were putting stuff up on the web, but it was still pretty limited. I remember in the 90s when I was at Tech, I worked in an archive. I worked at the Southwest Collection there. And, we had a computer, we had Alta Vista browsing system, right? And I always made a statement, I sat there for hours and hours every day at the reception desk waiting for people to come in, and I just surfed the web, right? Because it was new. And I got to the end of the web, I always like to say, because I just, where there wasn't any more information down a certain rabbit hole that you went down. Today, that's not the way things are. So much more is on the web. So when my dean was asking me in 2004, 2005, can't you just have students? Well, there's not a lot. There's, what you see on the web is kind of the same old sources. But today, there's been the land office has put so much information, so many primary sources that are in your holdings. The Texas State Library and Archive has done the same, and major research institutions around the state. The portal to Texas history is a fantastic resource. The Southwest Collection at Tech, where I used to work, and then University of Houston system has great primary sources, and they've been digitizing them. And now students have so much more access. When I was an undergraduate student, let me just put this in perspective for you. We were doing a statistical survey in one of my classes on Civil War history. And so we were looking at communities, going through the 1860 census and coding all this information and putting it into SPSS, which is a major number crunching program, right? Data analysis program. In those days, you had to enter a line by line. Line 10, it was almost like basic. Line 10, this number, line 12, this number, or this word, or whatever. And you wanted to do about 100, because if you messed up, you had to start all over again. Today, I mean, it's so much easier. People can put in thousands of bits of code because it's not as fussy as it used to be. Technology has changed a lot of it, I think, but the basic ideas are still the same. You still have to bring in that critical thinking piece. You still have to bring in historical thinking, which, you know, it's not just an event that happens. It's what are the background, what are the things that made that event possible. So in some cases, we're taking these critical thinking skills because historians look at it a little bit different from other disciplines. And we're looking at it with new methodologies, new technology. And so it has changed. And I think that students, we have to teach our students the new way of thinking and the new way of doing things.
For someone like me I've grown up with the internet always at my fingers, the idea of physical media getting spread out and not being able to find it is daunting. Back then, before computers were really kind of the thing and the internet was a thing, it almost seemed like you had to find the single needle in the haystack in order to make your research happen. Whereas today, you have millions, hundreds of thousands of hits whenever you do a Google search or you get on JSTOR, whatever service you use to do your research.
I guess it's like when I was going to school, you know, trying to get information was like, you know, going to the well in West Texas in the 1930s, you know, where you'd do a lot of pumping and a drop would come out and you'd be so thankful for that water. Yes, there's a lot of information coming in, and we have to teach students how to consider the source. Is it a reliable source? Is it a verifiable source? All history is interpretation. There are facts, but it's how we see it, how we perceive it, and how we make it real and actualize that information. That is what makes history important and what brings history to life. Look, history is not a slice of pie, and if we divide it up, it's going to get smaller and smaller. History is a big, enormous pie that we only know a little bit of. All we're doing is looking at the other flavors and the other varieties and the other ingredients in that pie. And I think that is what is important. There are stories about how history is not as popular as it once was. Not as many people are majoring in history. But if you actually look at the data in that report that Benjamin Schmidt wrote in Perspectives, the American Historical Association's magazine, a couple of years ago, what he says is that it's the big history, the general history. If you look at borderland studies, if you look at women's history, if you look at other things, those are actually growing and keeping a pace. So it's not that people are less interested in history. It's that people are more interested in more specific history about things they can relate to. And I think that's something that we have kind of gotten out of our sights recently, is that there are other ways, and that people do want to learn history about themselves. It tells different stories. What I want to do is try to help people do that. And this is why I think community history is so important to teach students and to help students learn. As I see all this information coming in, how do I make sense of it? How do I know what is right? That's a critical thinking exercise. And I think that it's something that we need to be focusing on, just like in your information technology class or information services classes, is that we need to tell students how to look for and discern what is right. When we're being told that, oh, you can't trust the media, you can't trust this, if you're being told that you can't trust anything, what are you going to trust? Well, you have to learn how to develop those skills yourself.
Which news source do you trust today?
I think historians, historians are part detectives, right? We really live for the hunt. And certainly there's bodies of information that people have used over and over again. But as we're digging through archives, as we're going through letters, we see references that other people may have glossed over. We see things that people mention that may not have meant something to another researcher, but to us is like, hey, has anybody looked at this? And so it's like a detective, right? That you're looking for clues. You may already have a broad interpretation of the story already laid out for you and the path laid out for you. But are there other ideas? Are there other avenues? One of the things that we tend to do as teachers, and I see this so frequently, is that we always tell students, and this, which is actually an improvement, is look at the primary sources, and we give them access to primary sources. Excuse me. But one of the harder things is getting students used to the secondary sources, right? So the secondary sources are the platform. Those are those old roads. So the students have to know the old roads and where they're going and what the end is going to be in order to look for other routes. And so we tend to go either one way or the other. Once it was all about reading the secondary information, then it was all about the primary sources. I think we need, like you were saying earlier, we need to find a middle road between the primary and the secondary sources so that students can see those new trails when they stumble across them.
Through your position with the university and various committees that you've been a part of, is that you're in a position to be able to influence people getting into the field of Texas history. How, in your mind, if you could wave a magic wand in order to get people, students, younger people involved in Texas history, what would you do?
Well, one of the things, the Texas State Historical Association actually has a really good group for college level and even younger kids interested in history, right? It's the Webb Society, Walter Prescott Webb Society. And then I think there's the junior historians for younger kids. And there's things like History Day that high schoolers can participate in to get them interested in history. And history is always, to borrow from the late Tip O'Neill, the Speaker of the House, I'm going to bring politics in here, who once famously said, all politics is local, all history is really local. We look and say, well, Texas history, that's so rudimentary, that's so provincial. Look, the Boston Massacre is provincial, right? It's about the history of Boston. The Salem witch trials are about a little community that no longer exists in Massachusetts, a small community of a few hundred people. All history is local. And so what I try to do is I try to get students to realize that look, we know that this happened. 1960s, we had a lot of Vietnam protests and civil rights issues. Well, they were going on here in Texas too, right? We know that there were civil rights movements happening in the Lone Star State. We know that there were Vietnam protests and that people were worried about their children going off to war here in Texas. We know there were civil rights demonstrations and marches. We know that there were people complaining about lynching. We know that there were troubles with elections and governors who were making decisions that were questioned. So all of the types of history and all of the things that we see in other states around the nation and nationally, we also see in Texas, and global things, because Texas has always had an international community of people living here. Now, it may not be in the far recesses of a corner of the state, but certainly in metropolitan areas like San Antonio, Dallas, El Paso, and Houston, you do have very complex and very diverse communities of people living together. And so people bring their history with them, right? People bring the events, what we're learning here. The Germans who came to Texas in the 1840s were certainly influenced by the revolutions going on in Germany in the 1840s. And so likewise, when people come to Texas, they bring their history, their past, their influences with them. And I think that's kind of where we start, is by looking, what interests you? Are you interested in sports? There's a lot of sports history in Texas. Are you interested in war? There's a lot of veterans living in Texas in military bases. What you're interested elsewhere or what might interest you, you can find. And it's building that interest and showing students how they can find history in their own backyard.
I know that you're involved with a lot of leadership and success projects. Briefly, talk a little bit about one of the projects that you're most excited about working on with your students today.
You're talking about leadership, and I've worked on some leadership projects. One of the things I want to do with some other things is start talking more about leaders. Anytime you have leadership programs or you offer courses in leadership, those fill up pretty fast at the college level or even in continuing education, leadership. I was talking to my older brother about this the other day, talking about leadership in Houston, and he made a comment that was really profound. He said, people are starving for leadership today, and that they look for it wherever they can find it. That's a good topic. What is leadership, and what do we want in a leader? Think about John Kennedy as president. He certainly did things that today people would blanch at. But in those days, most people didn't know because the news didn't report it. So I think things have changed. And I think that's something that students are really interested in. And besides the information, I think ideas of maybe what we expect out of leaders is something that students need to be introduced to. It's part of the discerning and critical thinking aspect.
Gene, I'm going to ask you two more questions. One of the most important right now is beans or no beans on chili.
Well, that probably may outside of leadership, it's really one of the most serious questions you've asked all day today. Chili is the official state dish of Texas. In the 1970s, the legislature proclaimed it and the governor signed it off. It's a state dish of chili. So people in Texas take a really, argumentative position on this. Should there be beans or no beans? My position is that chili has been around in some form or fashion for well over 100 years, at least, if not before. And like with any recipe, with any food that common people make, there's many ways of making it. So my thing is that, look, make your chili the way you want it, and make it the way you enjoy it. If you like beans, that's great. If you don't like beans, that's great. Don't say this is true Texas chili, because I think that's an ahistorical statement. And I think it's just, thinking that, oh, well, the chili contest rules are what determines what chili is. But people don't realize why those rules are in place. And they just think, oh, no beans in chili. No beans in contest chili, because they're trying to figure out what the chili itself tastes like.
So I think what the answer is, you'll know it when you taste it.
You'll know when you taste it, but generally, Gene Preuss's position is correct.
Okay, fair enough. So the final question I have is one that I ask all of our guests. What's your favorite piece of Texas history?
So my favorite map, let me start with the maps, is one that unfortunately I don't know that the land office owns, but it's the Pineda's map from 1519 of the Texas Gulf Coast. Well, the Gulf Coast. And I think he just called it the map of Florida. And you think that in 1519, and Coronado was going ashore and about to conquer the Aztecs. And in fact, they ran into each other, these two expeditions ran into each other and they got into a fight. And so Pineda draws this map, or has a map is drawn on Pineda's expedition. And if you look at Google Maps today, it's really amazing that somebody in a caravel, in a ship, who probably at the highest was maybe 50 feet off the sea level, and maybe the perch up on the top, was drawing this image of what they saw from sea level of the land. And if you look at a Google map taken from several miles above the earth by satellite and lay them over each other, it's remarkable at how well people in 1519 could draw a map. I don't think they used maps in the same way we do. I mean, they didn't know latitude, right, or longitude. They knew latitude, but they didn't know longitude. There was no good way of measuring it until almost the time of the American Civil War. So they used maps differently, especially navigation by sea. They wasn't like a GPS map, and it wasn't expected to be. They knew that wasn't going to happen. And I think that tells us something about the time people lived in those days. And I think that's important for students to understand. And this idea of presentism was like, well, why didn't they just know how to sail here? Well, because it wasn't possible in those days for a variety of reasons. So that's my favorite piece. That's my favorite map. The other map that I hold near and dear to my heart, you said mention one, but I'm going to mention two, is the Stephen F. Austin map of the Texas land grants, the impresario grants. And I think that is so important. And you think about Stephen F. Austin and why he came to Texas and why he took over his father's grant, that he didn't really want to, that he took it over because his father was dying and he felt a family obligation, and that he really didn't make any money off of the impresario grants that he provided. But he was the most successful of impresarios. And that when he died, it was only later that people considered him the father of Texas. I think, you think about him and his aspirations. I think that's very moving to me, that, we look back at it from our eyes and say, oh, well, this was important, but he was just trying to get by. And so I think that's an important thing to remember in Texas history.
Both good choices. No, the land office doesn't have a Pineda map, but we'd be willing to take one if anybody has one that they wanted to donate. So I'd like to thank Dr. Gene Preuss for spending time with us today to talk about the evolution of teaching Texas history and how the field has changed over time. Dr. Preuss, thank you for speaking with us today, and we hope to hear from you again.
Thank you for having me, James.
On behalf of Commissioner George P. Bush and the Texas General Land Office, thank you once again for joining us here. We'll be back next time with more This Week in Texas History.